1. Good morning. Today's lecture on the coming of the Civil War touches on some important aspects of Scripture. Both sides, as perhaps you know, made reference to Scripture in support of their relative position regarding slavery. It seems to me, though, that the northern view has the greater support of the New Testament. And I would like to quote a couple of the verses that Northerners often use to support their position. In Matthew's Gospel, verse 12, we read that Jesus says, "In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets." In other words, the law of love, of treating someone else the way you want them to treat you, is the summation of the Old Testament law and the prophets. And then in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give you," so this transcends the Old Testament, "that you love one another, even as I have loved you. That you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So this is the New Testament law of love. Again, the law of love that transcends anything in the Old Testament. Well, I'll reference these two scriptures and a host of others in a few minutes. The coming of the Civil War. I love this quote from Shakespeare's Macbeth, where it seems to capture the condition of the United States on the eve, and in fact during the Civil War. Shakespeare wrote, "I think our country sinks beneath the yoke. It weeps, it bleeds, and each new day a gash is added to her wounds." On the night of October 16th, 1859, John Brown, and John Brown is one of the most important figures of American history in this era. Brown, possessed of a fanatical zeal for his abolitionist views, seized the federal arsenal. That's where they keep the guns. The federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown's followers, only 19 people, included his sons and 5 blacks. Brown's purpose was to arm the slaves in the area. He believed that once the word got out that he had control of the arms at the federal arsenal, blacks would flock to the cause. This then would result in a rebellion that would spread throughout the South, an insurrection. But Brown's plan was not to be. He was soon surrounded by federal troops, and he had the misfortune of facing in command of those federal troops. Ironies are not short in the Civil War. Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, yes, the Robert E. Lee, who was aided by Jeb Stuart, another famous Confederate cavalryman of the war. Stuart now led the Marines in a charge of the Arsenal building. Brown was poised with rifle ready. But the Marines broke in the doors and entered the buildings, and one of the Marines then plunged his sword into Brown. The wound was not mortal, but the uprising was over. For Southerners, the worst crime Northerners could commit was to incite slave insurrection. There had been insurrections in the past, bloody insurrections in which slaves, escaped slaves, had killed dozens of whites. And so the impact of the raid on Harper's Ferry was substantial in the minds of Southerners. For most Southerners now, we're not inclined to see any difference between a radical abolitionist like John Brown and a much more moderate and calm Abraham Lincoln. Emotion obscured the difference between those who would drown slavery in blood and those who would merely contain it for the foreseeable future. An Atlanta newspaper, and if you're weak on geography, Atlanta is in Georgia, a southern state. An Atlanta newspaper said, "We regard every man in our midst an enemy who does not boldly declare that he believes African slavery to be a social, moral, and political blessing." In other words, if you don't agree with us, you're immoral, you're unpatriotic. By the way, we see a lot of people today take this point of view. It was in this frame of mind that the election of 1860 took place. If a Southerner were not elected president in 1860, the South would consider the president-elect an enemy. So do not underestimate the significance of John Brown and his raid in inflaming opinion in the nation, but especially in the South. Which brings us then to the election of 1860, one of the most crucial, if not the most crucial elections in the nation's history. The Democrats chose Charleston, South Carolina, as the locale for their convention. This was an unfortunate choice, for South Carolina was the most extreme of southern states. By the way, its counterpart in the north was Massachusetts, the most extreme of northern states. The Stephen Douglas wing of the party upheld its view that the slavery question should be left to those living in the West and the territories, where they would decide whether their territory was slave or free. This is the old popular sovereignty idea. But this idea, the Douglas idea, was no longer good enough for the more radical Southerners who, as we have seen, wanted a federal slave code, or they were going to secede. A federal slave code was the opposite of the Republican point of view, that there should be no slavery in the territories. The Southern slave code was that all the territories should be open to slavery. This is the old Justice Taney position. The convention disintegrated in Charleston, South Carolina, when the Douglas view prevailed, popular sovereignty, and then the Deep South states walked out. The Douglas wing of the party now reconvened in Baltimore in Maryland, still a southern state, but much farther north. And there they nominated Douglas on his popular sovereignty platform. So the Democratic Party is fracturing over the slavery issue. Now, the radicals of the Democratic Party also went to Baltimore, where they nominated the vice president, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, on the slave code platform. That is, slavery must be allowed to go out into the territories or secession. And so another cord of union was thus severed. There is now no national party. The Democrats have broken over the slavery issue. The Republicans have virtually no support in the South. Republicans, for their part, met in Chicago, where everything came together for the rail splitter from that state, Illinois. For the Lincoln-Douglas debates had made Lincoln a national figure, the Lincoln-Douglas debates that I spoke of from 1858. As far as the Republicans were concerned, Lincoln was seen as a moderate, strong enough on the containment of slavery to satisfy the abolitionists. The abolitionists know that he's not an abolitionist. They also know that he's opposed to slavery. And yet he was also seen by those who were less dedicated on the slavery issue, but nevertheless opposed to slavery. So Lincoln appealed to the anti-slavery / abolitionist point of view in the North. Lincoln's chief rival was William Seward of New York. And Seward had made remarks that tagged him as an abolitionist, probably unfairly. Seward spoke of a coming irrepressible conflict. And Seward deemed slavery immoral because of a higher law. And it's this higher law that I spoke of and read scriptures concerning just a few minutes ago. For the vast majority of Americans at this time were evangelical Christians, both North and South, by the way. If there has ever been a time when America was predominantly Christian, and I'm not suggesting that Christianity was the state religion or anything like that, but the vast majority of the American people viewed Christianity as the ultimate truth. There was any time where that was true, it's at this moment, at the end of the Second Great Awakening. When it became apparent that the moderate wing of the Republican Party would not have Seward, Lincoln then became the logical choice. The party platform of the Republicans is very important to understand. I'm not going to ask you a multiple choice question in which they're all there and you got to pick all of the above, but we need to have an understanding of who the Republicans were. Number one, and most important, it guaranteed the right of states, not territories, the right of states like Alabama or South Carolina to retain slavery. This is not an abolitionist platform. Number two, equally important, it reaffirmed the opposition of the extension of slavery into the territories. There will be no extension of slavery into any territory if the Republicans have their way. That meant that someday those territories without slavery would become states, and someday they would then be able to vote for a constitutional amendment to end slavery. So this no extension of slavery into the territories is a gradual way to end slavery. Number three, higher protective tariff for manufacturers. Raise the tariff. You know how Southerners feel about the tariff. Number four, free land out west for homesteaders. Move out west and you can have free land. So this is an effort to appeal to Westerners. Number five, federal aid to railroads. Railroads will get federal aid in order to build those railroads. And federal aid for other internal improvements. This is the old Whig position that they passed on to the Republicans. Note here that it is the Republican Party of the 1860s that is the party of an active federal government, a more powerful federal government, the federal government that is going to use the resources at its disposal to help build America. It's the Democratic Party that is opposed to using the federal government in this way, the party of a weaker federal government. Now, hopefully all of you realize that the two parties today have switched positions in general terms. That happens in the 20th century. But in the 19th century, the situation is reversed. So the Republican platform appealed to both Northeasterners, the high tariff and so forth, the slavery issue, and Westerners, internal improvements, free farms, if you move out there and give it a shot. But not all Northerners are happy with the Republicans. Die-hard Whigs, there are still some Whigs left. They nominated John Bell of Tennessee, border state, or, well, not exactly a border state, but a state that's in the middle of the country. And they nominated Bell on a unionist platform and said little about anything else, just that Bell stood for the maintenance of the Union. So 4 candidates vied for the highest national office in 1860, when the nation was rent by sectional strife and does not have a national media. There was no newspaper that had a national circulation. Clearly, you don't have radio and television at this time. So there's no national media that would itself serve as a binding factor in the country. And by the way, today our media is dividing left and right, conservative and liberal, and we are on the verge of not having a national media. Southerners then heard little of the real Abraham Lincoln and failed to understand that Lincoln was not a radical. Northerners knew little of John Breckinridge and failed to gain an understanding of the depth of feeling in the South. The contest was between Lincoln and Douglas in the North, Bell and Breckinridge in the South. Southerners could not hope to win the presidency without some Northern support. Thus, Lincoln or Douglas would be president. By midnight of November 6th, it was clear that Abraham Lincoln had won. Douglas's candidacy was the most national of the four. Douglas had supporters northwest, east, and south. You'd think that that might propel him to the presidency. That was certainly his hope. But because he appealed to the North, Southerners were very circumspect about Douglas, and vice versa. Douglas finishes last. Breckinridge, the radical Southern candidate, was second. He has the South. He gets 72 electoral votes, but that's far too few. You needed 180 to win. It was only a matter of time now before some Southern state made emotion reality, secession. For the South, the worst fears of 40 years had come true. The United States had never had a presidential administration that was opposed to slavery the way the Lincoln administration was. The election of 1860 had proved that the North was powerful enough to elect its own president no matter what the South did. And it was also powerful enough to elect a president who was committed to free labor ideology. And finally, was powerful enough to elect a president who believed that slavery was morally wrong. Then why wasn't Lincoln an abolitionist? Because Lincoln was also someone devoted to the Constitution, and Lincoln believed that the Constitution provided protections for slavery. The only way to get rid of slavery was to have a constitutional amendment. Well, if the South were to stay in the Union, it would have to take Lincoln's profession at face value, that he does not intend to end slavery in the Southern states. He said it many times. But he does hope that someday, no doubt well after he has served 2 terms, the Republicans then would be able to pass a constitutional amendment with those new Western states that would end slavery. This is the full position of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln. But that was a distant future, and if the Republicans had their way, the Southerners would see the handwriting on the wall, so to speak, and gradually adapt over time to that. Well, the Southerners understood this as well. And the majority of people of the South were not willing to stay in the Union on those terms. So they didn't really misunderstand Abraham Lincoln as much as some authors suggest. It's a question of timing. And it's for this reason that the Civil War was always about slavery. I don't know how many times I've heard an otherwise intelligent person say that the Civil War was transformed in 1863 when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. No, the war was always about slavery. What the Emancipation Proclamation did was change the emancipation of the slaves from a long-term prospect to an immediate prospect. Didn't transform the war at all. It just moved up that war goal. Secession. In Charleston on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina held a state convention. The kind of convention which had ratified the Constitution so many years before. This Constitution passed an ordinance of secession. A declaration of the causes of secession, the Declaration of Independence of the state of South Carolina, if you will, made the threat to that state's institution of slavery the primary motive. This is not hard to find, folks. South Carolina's declaration quoted Lincoln's own words. Number one, government cannot endure half slave and half free. So slavery, right at the forefront. Lincoln intends to put what? Slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. Yes, he does. By not allowing it to expand west into the territories, ultimately that would kill slavery. South Carolina knows this and puts it in their Declaration of Causes. So South Carolina now tells us clearly why it seceded. It secedes because it is convinced that slavery, if it stays in the Union, would someday be ended. President Buchanan was not Andrew Jackson. Lincoln's not taken office yet. When Jackson had been faced with South Carolina's threat of secession, he had mobilized the troops. And he had politically isolated the state. Buchanan said, "There's nothing I can do," thus virtually inviting other states to secede. By February 1st, just before Lincoln's inauguration, February 1st, 1861, 6 more states had declared themselves out of the Union. On February 4th, a convention of the seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama, where they adopted a constitution and elected Jefferson Davis of Mississippi president of the Confederacy. Ultimately, secession and Civil War came because both North and South had changed their views about slavery. They had changed their views about slavery from the time of the Founding Fathers. Let me say that again. Both sides had changed their views about slavery. At the time of the Founding Fathers and the creation of the Constitution, both regions saw slavery as a temporary evil. A temporary evil that was largely the product of British colonialism. And leaders, founding fathers of both North and South, the majority of them anyway, hoped that slavery, a moral evil, would gradually die. But in the 19th century, the South increasingly came to regard black slavery as the base of their economy, absolutely essential to grow cotton, and thus their freedom and prosperity rested on the backs of black people. They began to argue that slavery, far from evil, was necessary and good. They essentially ignored those scriptural passages that I quoted to you and many others. For the North, a commitment to slavery's ultimate extinction had become the test of freedom, of the value of the words in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Each section then detected a cataclysmic change in the other section. And there was a change in both sections. And each section saw that change as a betrayal of the promises in the Constitution. On this ground, would both fight Why doesn't Lincoln just let the South go? Good question. Number one, and most importantly, if Lincoln just lets the Southerners go, that would mean that he would be essentially giving up on the idea of gradually ending slavery. If the South is an independent nation, Northerners have no control over slavery. So there's that. And many people believe that if Lincoln just let the Southerners go, there would be no war, but that's not true. Where would the war take place? Both North and South would continue to fight over the territories out west. For those territories would be open to either slave or free, depending upon who controls what. And who controls what out there would eventually have enough power to overthrow slavery in the South or to make the entire North American continent a slave continent. So you see, just letting the Southerners go doesn't solve anything. The war just moves out west. And then, of course, as wars often do, it expands and ripples back east. And then finally, and this is what the Republicans emphasized for a time, which is so confusing to historians. It shouldn't be, but it is. Secession would mean the end of the democratic experiment. How so? Well, keep in mind that democracy in America is essentially the only democratic experiment taking place in the world at this time. In the 19th century, the world is a world of monarchies, not democracies. And if the Southerners make good their secession from democracy, largely because they lost the election of 1860, that would mean that a democratic nation cannot hold itself together. Secession would become a precedent. And whenever a group of citizens, whether they be a county in a state or other states, lost in elections, they would be tempted to secede. Democracy in this scenario then leads to chaos, political chaos. So for all of those reasons, Lincoln's not going to let the South secede peaceably. Lincoln's inaugural. Between the election and Lincoln's inaugural, there were numerous efforts to find a compromise that would keep most of the southern states in the Union, especially the border states. These compromises generally featured a guarantee of slavery in the territories south of 3630. That would be the old Missouri Compromise. So the Southwest. You could have slavery in those territories and reserve the territories, Kansas, Nebraska, etc., to the north for free states. So the attempt to resurrect the Compromise of 1820. Lincoln, however, would abide no such compromise. Not going to compromise on that. What's the Republican Party platform? No extension of slavery into the territories, either north or south. So Lincoln always says no. He said to those who were seeking such a compromise, entertain no proposition for a compromise in regard to the extension of slavery. The tug has to come. We have to resolve this problem, the tug. And better now than any time hereafter. No, we need to face this question. Jefferson Davis, though, was equally opposed to compromise. No human power, he said, can save the Union. All the cotton states will go. Still, the upper South or the border states waited to hear what the man from Illinois was going to say in his inaugural address in March of 1861. So a long time between the election in November and the inaugural address in March, 4 months. The whole country believed that without Virginia, and as yet, Virginia has not seceded. Without Virginia, North Carolina, and some other border states, the South would have a tough time achieving independence. Virginia was the most populated of the southern states. It had the most industry, etc. Now, there were two essential themes in Lincoln's inaugural address. The olive branch, peace, and the sword, war. In regard to the first, Lincoln repeated his pledge that slavery in the southern states would not be interfered with. And Lincoln does not believe that the time will ever come in his 2 terms, if he's fortunate enough to earn 2 terms, that there would be enough support in the North for a constitutional amendment. So he's honest here. I'm not going to interfere with slavery in the southern states. And he also said that the federal government would enforce the fugitive slave law. So federal agents are going to search for and capture escaped slaves in the North and take them back to their masters. He is trying to conciliate the South. Of course, for the true abolitionists in the North, this was unacceptable. They wished that he would change his mind. They intended to pressure him to do so. However, Lincoln's intent to preserve the Union was also clear. He promised to use, and I quote now from the speech, all the powers at my disposal to reclaim the public places and property, that is, the places and property that belong to the federal government, that have fallen, and yes, they have fallen to the southern seceded states, to hold, occupy, and possess these properties, and all other property in places belonging to the government. Every single post office in every little town is a federal building. And to collect the duties on imports. So again, there's a federal tax collector, customs collector at every port in the South. He is going to continue, they are, under his direction, going to continue to perform their functions. By this time, only 2 federal forts remained in Union hands. That's Fort Pickens and Fort Sumter. It was Lincoln's view, following Andrew Jackson's nullification message of 1832, that the Union actually preceded the Constitution in existence. So the Union for Lincoln is not formed when the Constitution becomes official. In my opinion, he's on weak ground here. For Lincoln, the Union comes into existence under the Articles of Association in 1774. And therefore, since the Union preceded the Constitution, secession could not be constitutional. Moreover, if the Union were a mere collection of sovereign states, as the Southerners claimed them to be, Lincoln argued that the only way a state could secede is if all the other states agreed to let them go. That was unlikely to happen. Lincoln finished with an emotional plea to the South. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union. When again touched, as surely as they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Sadly, tragically, Lincoln's plea had no effect. In a few weeks, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee joined the 7 other seceded states in secession. And so the Confederacy would eventually number 11. And if Lincoln had not held Kentucky and perhaps some other border states, they too would have seceded. I mean by armed force. Fort Sumter. But for now, before the secession of Virginia, etc., Lincoln's problem was how to reclaim, hold, and possess federal territory in the South. Everyone's attention was on Sumter, Fort Sumter, in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. If the South had any notion of achieving respect as an independent nation, then they could not allow the Union forces to hold Sumter there at the mouth of the harbor of one of the most important ports in the South. Then, too, if Lincoln intended the world to take seriously his statement that he intended to hold, occupy, and possess federal property, then he had to hold on to Sumter. But other issues clouded these obvious considerations. How Lincoln approached the problem might impact the decision of some of the states as to whether they would secede or stay in the Union, especially a state like Virginia. Now, both time and supplies were running low at Fort Sumter. There are federal troops who are holding the fort. Lincoln essentially has three choices. One, he could send the Navy, and with the idea of shooting its way into Sumter to resupply and reinforce the fort. If he does this, the war is on. He will have fired the first shot and would also have guaranteed the secession of states that were on the fence, like Virginia at this point. Two, he could give up Sumter. He could withdraw the garrison. And if he does this, he's contradicting his policies that he expressed in the first inaugural address. And that would probably have destroyed his administration before it really even began. Three, he could play for time, hoping a solution would present itself as he waited. Lincoln chose that option, to wait. Then, as it was clear that time was running out, he decided to send an expedition of supply. He told the world, he told the South that he was sending ships, but no reinforcements, just supplies for hungry men. As historian James N. McPherson, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his History of the Civil War, Battle Cry of Freedom, the most important book on the war, published a little over 30 years ago now, I think. McPherson said this was a stroke of genius. If the South opened fire on the unarmed boats carrying supplies for hungry men, essentially a humanitarian mission, it would bear the moral responsibility for starting the war. If, however, the South allowed the North to resupply the fort, the Union would have won an important symbolic victory, a psychological victory, and there was already grumbling amongst some of the southern states, what are we waiting for? And there was even talk of re-entering the Union if the South was not serious about independence. So in effect, Lincoln had contrived a heads I win, tails you lose strategy. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, knew now that he was in a tough spot. What do I do? Well, you have to act at some point. In the end, Davis had to make good on Southern claims to independence. So he ordered General Beauregard, who was in command of the garrison in Charleston, to open fire on the fort. Confederate artillery ringed the harbor, pointing out into the harbor at Fort Sumter. Someday I hope you have the opportunity to go to Charleston. It's a beautiful city, by the way, and then visit Fort Sumter and see how the geography of this played out. Beauregard's guns began shelling the fort on April 12th, and so this is the official date of the beginning of the Civil War. The fort surrendered 2 days later on the 14th. The first battle was a Confederate victory, and no one was killed. Both results, a Confederate victory with no deaths, were poor omens of what awaited both sides. Summary. The origins of the Civil War are not hard to find for historians who desire first and foremost to understand the past, to know the truth, and don't care about politics or historical theories. The two regions had grown apart over the future of slavery in the territories, and they had grown apart over the morality of slavery itself. Moreover, most Northerners were convinced that Southern secession would mean the end of democracy, as I have explained already. The confrontation over slavery would now be decided in the shedding of fraternal blood. Fraternal means brothers. Perhaps the origins of the war are best explained in this formulation. The dispute over slavery was the long-term cause of the war. If there had not been slavery in the United States, there would have been no Civil War, period. But one must still explain why the war came when it did. And when the Southerners decided the only way to protect slavery was secession, that secession is what triggered the Civil War. So we may say that secession is the immediate cause of the war. The problem with saying only that, though, as many Southerners do and many Northerners do, secession caused the war, is that it begs the question, well, what caused the secession? And that answer, of course, is slavery. So don't be surprised if your professor formulates the question in this way. Well, I thank you for your attention. And as always, I pray that you will have the grace and faith that the Lord Jesus Christ provides.